Keanu Reeves stepped out of the black SUV and took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the familiar red brick facade of St. Michael's Catholic School. The building had changed little since he had walked these halls as a teenager, its tall windows still glinting in the midday sun, the front steps still worn smooth by decades of students rushing in and out. He hadn't planned to stop here today. His schedule was packed, and his assistant was already checking her watch with a silent urgency, but something had pulled him back. This place held memories, some good, some difficult. It was here that he had first discovered a love for acting, sneaking into the empty auditorium after school to rehearse lines from old plays. It was here that he had struggled with academics, feeling restless, in classrooms that seemed to move too slowly for his mind. And it was here, in the dimly lit hallways, that he had learned to carry his own weight, to face the world without expecting it to be kind. "We're running behind, Keanu," said Daniel, his assistant, lowering his voice as he stepped closer. "The press is expecting you at the charity gala in an hour." Keanu nodded but didn't move. His gaze lingered on the entrance, the heavy wooden doors propped open just enough to let in the warm afternoon air. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe just a feeling, a reminder of who he had been before Hollywood, before the fame, before the tragedies and the triumphs. "This won't take long," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Daniel hesitated, then sighed and took a step back to make a phone call. Keanu pushed open the door and stepped inside. The scent hit him, first-floor polish and old books, the unmistakable aroma of a school that had weathered decades of eager footsteps and whispered conversations. The hallway was empty, the faint hum of a distant vacuum the only sound. For a moment, he was 17 again, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his heart pounding as he rushed to class. He walked forward slowly, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the lockers as he passed. The old math classroom was still there. The library, where he had once hidden with a tattered copy of Shakespeare, looked just as he remembered. Then, from around the corner, he heard a slow, rhythmic sound, the soft squeak of a mop against tile. Keanu turned the corner and stopped. A man was working near the end of the hallway, his back slightly hunched as he pushed the mop forward, carefully wiping away what looked like a spilled drink. His uniform was the same faded navy blue that all the janitors had worn when Keanu was a student, his movements slow but methodical. He straightened with effort, rubbing his lower back before reaching for the mop bucket. Keanu felt a strange pull in his chest. Something about the way the man moved, the way he adjusted his cap, seemed eerily familiar. The janitor turned around, and Keanu's breath caught. "Mr. Morales?" The old man squinted at him, his weathered face creasing with surprise. For a moment, he simply stared, his dark eyes scanning Keanu's face, searching through the years. Then, slowly, recognition dawned. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Little Keanu Reeves." Keanu let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Not so little anymore." Mr. Morales chuckled, leaning on his mop. "No, I suppose not. But I'd know those eyes anywhere. Always had that faraway look, like you were dreaming of someplace bigger." Keanu took a step closer, still trying to process what he was seeing. The last time he had spoken to Mr. Morales, he had been a restless teenager, eager to escape the confines of high school and chase something bigger. Now, decades later, the old janitor was still here, still cleaning these floors, still wearing the same quiet expression of patience and resilience. "You're still working here?" Keanu asked, his voice softer now. Mr. Morales nodded, glancing around the empty hallway. "Where else would I go? This place has been my home for 53 years. Keanu did the math quickly in his head. 53 years. That meant Mr. Morales had started working here long before Keanu was even born. Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. "Come, let's sit for a minute," Keanu said, motioning toward a nearby bench. Mr. Morales hesitated, then nodded, setting the mop aside. He moved slowly, carefully, lowering himself onto the bench with a slight wince. Keanu sat beside him. "You were always kind to me," Keanu said after a moment. "When I was here." The old janitor smiled. "You were a good kid. Always had something on your mind. Always thinking. I remember you used to help me clean up the art room sometimes. Said you didn't like going home right away." Keanu swallowed hard. He had forgotten about that. The afternoons he had lingered after school, pretending to help clean just to avoid the loneliness waiting for him at home. Mr. Morales chuckled. One time, you told me you were going to be in the movies. Said you'd buy me a big house someday. Keanu blinked. The memory was hazy, but it was there a teenage version of himself, full of dreams and promises. The weight of the years pressed down on him, and then something in his chest shifted. Mr. Morales, Keanu said slowly, turning to face him fully. What if I told you I still want to keep that promise? Mr. Morales let out a raspy chuckle, shaking his head as if Keanu had just told him some far-fetched story. Oh, come on now, the old man said, waving a hand dismissively. You don't owe me anything, son. Life's been what it's been. I'm just glad to see you doing well. But Keanu wasn't smiling. He was watching the old janitor carefully, noticing things he hadn't before, the way his fingers trembled slightly as he rested them on his knee, the tired look in his eyes, the deep lines on his face that spoke of years of quiet endurance. How much do they pay you here? Keanu asked suddenly. Mr. Morales shrugged. Enough to get by. Keanu knew that wasn't true. He had read enough stories about how janitors, especially those who had been working for decades, barely earned enough to cover basic expenses. And at his age, when was the last time you took a vacation? Keanu asked. The old man laughed again, this time softer. Vacation? He shook his head. Never really had the time or the money for that. But it's all right. I like being here. Keeps me moving. Keanu exhaled slowly, leaning back against the bench. He had spent most of his life surrounded by wealth movie sets, private jets, luxurious hotels, but this moment, sitting in a quiet school hallway with an old janitor who had once looked out for him, felt more real than anything he had experienced in years. This isn't right, Keanu muttered under his breath, mostly to himself. Mr. Morales turned his head slightly. What isn't? Keanu hesitated. He had spent his entire career trying to be careful with his generosity. He had given away millions, helped countless people, but he never wanted to make someone feel like a charity case. This was different. This was personal. I want to do something for you, Keanu said finally. Mr. Morales shook his head again, giving a tired smile. That's kind of you, son, but I'm fine. Keanu leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. No, you're not, he said gently. You're 80 years old, and you're still mopping floors. You've given this school over 50 years of your life. Someone should be taking care of you now. The old man's smile faded just a little, as if Keanu had said something he had tried not to think about for a long time. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. Let me do something for you, he said again. I mean it. Mr. Morales watched him, his expression unreadable. And what exactly do you have in mind, Mr. Hollywood? He asked, a teasing edge to his voice. Keanu looked up, his dark eyes steady. I want to change your life. Mr. Morales exhaled slowly, his hands resting on his knees as he stared down the empty hallway. Keanu could see the gears turning in his mind, the weight of a lifetime of habit pressing down on him. Change, even good change, was hard to accept after so many years of simply enduring. You know, mister, Morales finally said, rubbing his chin, I've lived in the same small apartment for 40 years. Same old couch, same old television that barely works. Never really thought about leaving. Never thought I could. Keanu leaned forward slightly. You can. You deserve to. The old janitor let out a slow chuckle. And where exactly would you put an old man like me? Keanu smiled. Somewhere with a view. Somewhere quiet. You ever been to Hawaii? Mr. Morales' eyebrows lifted. Hawaii? The closest I've been to the ocean is the public pool down on Elm Street. Keanu laughed softly. Then that settles it. You're going to the ocean. The old man studied Keanu for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping his knees. It was clear he wasn't used to being on the receiving end of generosity. He had spent his entire life being the one who cleaned up after others, never expecting anything in return. Keanu recognized that feeling. I don't know what to say, Mr. Morales admitted, his voice quieter now. You don't have to say anything, Keanu replied. Just promise me you'll let me do this. There was another pause, and then, for the first time in a long time, Keanu saw something shift in the old man's expression. A crack in the walls he had built around himself. A flicker of something close to acceptance. All right, Mr. Morales said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu smiled. Good. He pulled out his phone again. Because I've already got a place in mind. The old janitor shook his head, letting out a deep laugh, a sound filled with something Keanu could only describe as disbelief. You're serious about this, aren't you? Keanu grinned. Always. And in that moment, sitting on an old wooden bench in the hallway of his former high school, Keanu Reeves knew that this was one of the best decisions he had ever made. Mr. Morales let out another deep chuckle, shaking his head as if trying to wake himself from a dream. You know, Keanu, I've spent my whole life working. I don't know what it feels like to wake up and have nothing to do. Keanu slipped his phone back into his pocket and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. That's the thing, Mr. Morales. You won't have nothing to do. You'll have freedom. And freedom means you get to decide what your days look like. The old man exhaled, his gaze drifting down the hallway, as if seeing his entire life stretched out before him every late night, every early morning, every quiet moment spent pushing a mop through these halls while the world rushed on without him. I guess I never thought about it like that, he murmured. Keanu smiled. Then it's about time you did. A comfortable silence settled between them. The school was empty now, the distant hum of fluorescent lights the only sound in the corridor. Keanu had been in countless interviews, press conferences, red carpet events moments where he had to be larger than life. But here, sitting next to the man who had once kept an eye out for him in ways he hadn't even realized at the time, he felt more grounded than he had in years. You know, Keanu said after a moment, when I was a kid, I never really had a place that felt like home. My family moved around a lot. Schools changed. Friends came and went. He glanced at Mr. Morales. But this place, it was the closest thing I had, and you were one of the constants. Mr. Morales looked over at him, his expression unreadable at first. Then, slowly, he nodded. Did my best, he said simply. Keanu's throat tightened. He had spent so many years running forward, always chasing something new, always trying to stay one step ahead of the past. But maybe, just maybe, some things deserve to be revisited. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notepad and a pen. All right, he said, flipping to a blank page. Let's make a list. Mr. Morales frowned. A list? Keanu nodded. Things you've always wanted to do but never had the chance. The old janitor let out a surprised laugh. Kid, I'm 80 years old. You think I've got some kind of bucket list? Keanu raised an eyebrow. You telling me you've never had dreams? Mr. Morales opened his mouth, then shut it again. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. He rubbed his chin, then sighed. Well, I always did want to see the Grand Canyon. Keanu grinned and wrote it down. Grand Canyon. What else? Mr. Morales hesitated, then said, always wanted to ride a horse. A real one, not those carnival ponies. Keanu nodded and scribbled it down. Done. The old man's lips twitched, as if he were trying to suppress a smile, and I've never had lobster. Keanu's head shot up. Wait, seriously? Mr. Morales shrugged. Never saw the point. Too expensive. Keanu shook his head in mock disbelief. All right, well, that's unacceptable. Lobster goes on the list. He jotted it down with a flourish. For the first time since they had started talking, Mr. Morales looked lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted, even if just a little. You're really doing this, the old man said quietly. Keanu looked at him, his expression serious. Yeah, I am. The hallway was silent again, but this time, it wasn't the heavy kind of silence, it was something else. Something filled with possibility. And for the first time in 53 years, Salvador Morales let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, his best days weren't behind him. Mr. Morales stared at the list in Keanu's hands, shaking his head as if he still couldn't quite believe what was happening. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, the ink still fresh, each word a small rebellion against the life he had resigned himself to. You know, he murmured, his voice quieter now, I spent years watching kids walk these halls, wondering where life would take them. Doctors, lawyers, teachers. Some of them probably forgot this place the second they left. He glanced at Keanu. But you came back. Keanu smiled slightly. I guess I never really left. The old janitor let out a slow breath. And now, you're dragging me out of here, huh? Keanu laughed. Not dragging, just giving you a push in the right direction. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mr. Morales let out a soft chuckle. All right, kid, you win. Keanu grinned. That's what I like to hear. He stood up and stretched, slipping the notepad back into his pocket. All right, first things first. You're not spending another night in that old apartment of yours. I'm putting you in a hotel until we figure out the next step. Mr. Morales raised an eyebrow. A hotel? Keanu nodded. A nice one, with a view. And room service. The old man scoffed. I wouldn't even know what to do with room service. Keanu smirked. Order lobster. Mr. Morales let out a laugh, shaking his head. You really don't take no for an answer, do you? Not when it comes to people who matter, Keanu said simply. The janitor studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His movements were careful, his body stiff from years of labor, but there was something different about the way he stood now, something lighter. All right, Mr. Hollywood, he said, adjusting his cap. Let's see where this crazy idea of yours takes us. Keanu clapped a hand on his shoulder. That's the spirit. They walked down the empty hallway together, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly against the walls. As they reached the front doors, Mr. Morales paused. He turned back for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the quiet school, the place he had called home for more than half a century. Strange feeling, he murmured. Keanu glanced at him. Leaving? Mr. Morales nodded. Didn't think I ever would. Keanu smiled. Sometimes the best chapters start when you least expect them. The old janitor let out a slow breath. Then, with a small nod, he pushed open the door and stepped outside. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the school grounds. Keanu's car was waiting by the curb, the driver already stepping out to open the door. After you, Keanu said, motioning toward the car. Mr. Morales hesitated only a second before stepping forward, sliding into the leather seat with a slow exhale. He looked around, his fingers running over the polished interior. Well, this is a step up from my old bus pass, he muttered. Keanu laughed as he got in beside him. Get used to it. The driver pulled away from the curb, the school fading into the background. Mr. Morales stared out the window, watching the city roll by, his mind racing with possibilities he had never let himself consider before. Keanu leaned back, glancing at the notepad still tucked in his jacket. This was just the beginning. And he had a feeling Mr. Morales' list was about to get a whole lot longer. Mr. Morales sat back in the plush leather seat, his fingers absently tapping against the armrest as the car glided smoothly through the streets. The world outside looked different from inside a car like this, quieter, almost surreal. He had spent his whole life walking, taking buses, always moving through the city at a pace that forced him to feel every inch of it. Now, as the car hummed forward, insulated from the honking horns and hurried footsteps outside, he felt like he was watching someone else's life unfold. Keanu glanced over at him. You all right? The old man let out a dry chuckle. I think I'm still waiting for you to tell me this is all some elaborate prank. Keanu grinned. I don't do pranks. Mr. Morales shook his head, looking out the window again. You know, the last time I sat in a car this nice was never. Keanu smirked. That's going to change. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the city lights flickering past. Mr. Morales watched them carefully, as if memorizing every detail. Then, as they rounded a corner, a thought struck him. Where are we going exactly? Keanu leaned back, a playful glint in his eye. First stop? A hotel. A good one. After that, we'll see. Mr. Morales raised an eyebrow. You're just making this up as you go, aren't you? Keanu laughed. Maybe a little. The old janitor exhaled, shaking his head. You really think you can just take a guy like me, pull him out of the life he's known for 50 years, and what? Turn me into some kind of retiree who lounges around all day? Keanu studied him for a second. No, he said. I think I can give you a choice. Mr. Morales frowned slightly. Keanu continued. All your life, you've done what you had to do. You worked hard. You took care of things. But no one ever gave you options. You just kept going because you had to. I want to change that. Mr. Morales didn't respond right away. His hands were folded in his lap now, fingers intertwined, his mind clearly wrestling with something deeper than the words they were exchanging. Choice, he murmured finally. That's a funny thing. I don't think I ever thought about what I'd do if I had one. Keanu smiled softly. Then let's figure it out. The car pulled up in front of a towering hotel, the entrance gleaming under the soft glow of golden lights. A valet rushed forward, already reaching for the door handle. Mr. Morales blinked. This is where I'm staying? Keanu nodded. For now. The old man let out a low whistle as he stepped out, craning his neck to take in the massive glass structure in front of him. The lobby alone looked bigger than his entire apartment building. Not bad, he muttered. Keanu smirked. Wait till you see the room. They walked through the grand entrance, the marble floors gleaming under chandeliers that probably cost more than Mr. Morales had earned in a decade. He felt out of place, his work-worn hands brushing against the fabric of his old janitor's uniform. The receptionist barely batted an eye as Keanu checked in, handing over a key card with a polite nod. "Penthouse suite is ready, Mr. Reeves." Mr. Morales coughed. "Penthouse?" Keanu winked. "Figured we'd start you off at the top." The old janitor shook his head again, his expression somewhere between disbelief and amusement. As they stepped into the private elevator, Keanu glanced over at him. "You nervous?" Mr. Morales exhaled. "More like wondering if I'm going to wake up back in my old apartment, late for work." Keanu clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You're not. This is real." The elevator doors slid open, revealing a suite that looked like something out of a movie floor-to-ceiling windows. Plush furniture, a view of the entire city twinkling below. Mr. Morales stepped in slowly, his eyes scanning the space. He ran a hand along the back of a sleek leather couch, then over the polished dining table. Finally, he walked to the window, staring out at the world from a height he had never imagined. After a long moment, he let out a soft breath. "Well, damn," he muttered. Keanu laughed. "Not bad, right?" The old man turned slightly, his face unreadable. "It's a lot." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, it is." Another pause. Then, suddenly, Mr. Morales did something Keanu hadn't expected. He smiled. A real full smile, the kind that erased decades of exhaustion from his face. "You know what?" the old janitor said, still staring out at the city below. "I think I could get used to this." Keanu grinned. "That's the idea." They stood there for a moment, two men from completely different worlds, connected by something bigger than chance. And, for the first time in 53 years, Mr. Morales wasn't just watching life pass him by. He was stepping into it. Mr. Morales turned away from the window, still shaking his head in disbelief as he took in the luxurious suite. He let out a breath, slow and measured, as if trying to ground himself in reality. "You really went all out, huh?" he muttered, running a hand over the smooth leather armrest of a chair that probably cost more than his entire life's earnings. Keanu smirked. "Only the best." The old janitor chuckled, lowering himself carefully into the chair. It was the first time Keanu had seen him sit without wincing from stiff joints or aching knees. Mr. Morales stretched his legs out slightly, testing the comfort beneath him. "Damn," he said under his breath. "Feels like I'm sitting on a cloud." Keanu grinned. "Told you." The silence that followed wasn't awkward but reflective. The weight of what had just happened still hung between them. Then, after a long pause, Mr. Morales said, "All right, kid, what's the catch?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Catch?" The old man narrowed his eyes slightly. "Come on, nobody just does this. Not for an old janitor. Not for a guy who spent his life mopping floors." Keanu exhaled, leaning forward. "You ever hear the story about the guy who ran into a storm instead of away from it?" Mr. Morales frowned slightly, shaking his head. Keanu continued. "Buffalo, when they see a storm coming, don't run away like other animals. They charge straight into it. It's faster that way. They get through it quicker instead of dragging it out." Mr. Morales studied him. "And you're saying, what? That I've been running into storms my whole life?" Keanu nodded. "And now, it's time for clear skies." The old man let that sink in. He exhaled slowly, nodding to himself as if something deep inside him had finally clicked. Keanu leaned back, watching him closely. "And for the record, you weren't just a janitor. You were the guy who kept the lights on for kids like me. You were the guy who made sure we had somewhere safe to go when no one else was looking out for us." Mr. Morales swallowed, his throat bobbing slightly. He glanced at Keanu, his voice quieter now. "You really remember all that?" Keanu nodded. "Every bit of it." For the first time, Mr. Morales didn't argue, didn't brush it off. He just sat there, letting himself believe it. Then, finally, he let out a slow, measured breath. "Well then," he said, stretching his fingers slightly. "I guess I'd better figure out what the hell I do next." Keanu smirked. "That's the fun part." Mr. Morales gave him a look. "Yeah? You ever retire from something you've done your whole life?" Keanu laughed. "Not yet, but I hear it's nice." The old man shook his head, still half disbelieving, but this time there was something else behind his expression, something Keanu hadn't seen before. Hope. Mr. Morales stood up, cracking his back slightly. All right, hot shot. First things first. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Yeah? The old man grinned. I believe you owe me some damn lobster. Keanu burst out laughing. Now you're talking. He pulled out his phone, already dialing. Room service? Yeah, we're going to need the biggest lobster you've got. Mr. Morales chuckled, shaking his head as he walked toward the window again, looking out over the vast city below. And for the first time in his life, he saw it not as something passing him by, but as something that, for once, was his to explore. Keanu hung up the phone, smirking. Lobsters on the way. Mr. Morales chuckled, still gazing out at the city. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, the streets below buzzing with life. He had spent his entire existence moving through those streets, unnoticed, unremarkable. But now, from up here, it all looked different. I'll tell you something, kid, he said, his voice carrying the weight of years gone by. I never thought I'd see the world from this high up. Keanu stepped beside him, hands in his pockets. Feels different, doesn't it? The old man nodded. It does. He tapped a knuckle lightly against the glass. It's funny. You clean floors long enough, you stop looking up. Keanu tilted his head. And now? Mr. Morales inhaled deeply. Now, I think I might start. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. Keanu grinned. That'll be your lobster. He strode over, pulling the door open as a hotel staff member rolled in a silver cart, the domed tray covering the meal. The scent of butter and garlic filled the air, making Mr. Morales raise an eyebrow. Smells like money, he muttered, eyeing the setup. Keanu laughed. It's just lobster. Go on, try it. The old man hesitated only a second before sitting down at the grand dining table. He picked up the silverware with a careful reverence, as if afraid he might somehow do it wrong. Keanu watched, amused but patient, as Mr. Morales cracked open a claw and took his first bite. The reaction was immediate. His eyes widened, and he let out a satisfied groan. Oh, hell, he muttered through a mouthful. I've been missing out. Keanu grinned. Told you. Mr. Morales took another bite, shaking his head in amazement. Man, if I'd known lobster tasted like this, I would have quit my job 40 years ago. Keanu smirked. That's why I'm here, to make up for lost time. For the next hour, they ate and talked. The conversation flowed naturally, stories from the past intertwining with plans for the future. So what's next? Keanu finally asked, leaning back in his chair. Mr. Morales wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, setting it down carefully. He thought for a moment, then looked up. Well, I guess I've got a list to get through, don't I? Keanu grinned. Yeah, you do. The old janitor exhaled, staring down at his hands. It's strange, he admitted. Spending so long in one place, you start to think you don't belong anywhere else. Keanu leaned forward. You belong anywhere you want to be. Mr. Morales studied him, then nodded slowly. All right, he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Then, let's see what the world has to offer. Keanu lifted his glass in a silent toast. To new beginnings, he said. Mr. Morales picked up his own glass, pausing for just a moment before clinking it softly against Keanu's. To new beginnings. As the city lights shimmered below them, two Minone, a Hollywood icon, the other a quiet figure in the background of so many lives sat together, sharing a meal, sharing a moment, and, for the first time in a long time, sharing the limitless possibilities of what came next. The night stretched on, filled with laughter, stories, and a quiet sense of understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Mr. Morales, for the first time in decades, wasn't thinking about tomorrow's shift, wasn't worrying about rent, wasn't wondering how much longer his body could keep up with the demands of the job. Instead, he was sitting in a penthouse, in a hotel he never would have dared step foot in before, eating a meal he had once considered a luxury far beyond his reach. And across from him sat Keanu Reeves, a kid he had once known as a quiet teenager with big dreams, now a man who had somehow come back into his life to shake everything up. As the plates were cleared away, Keanu leaned back in his chair, studying the old janitor with curiosity. So, he said, if you could wake up tomorrow and be anywhere doing anywhere, would that be? Mr. Morales let out a breath, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. You keep asking me these big questions, kid, he muttered. Keanu smirked. That's kind of my thing. The old man thought for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. You know, he said slowly, I always wanted to see the northern lights. Keanu's eyebrows lifted. Yeah? Mr. Morales nodded. Used to read about him when I was younger, those colors moving through the sky like magic. Thought maybe one day I'd go see him myself, but life got in the way. And then, well, 1 year turned into 10, 10 turned into 50. He exhaled. And here we are. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on the table. We can fix that. Mr. Morales chuckled. You say that like you can just snap your fingers and make it happen. Keanu grinned. Pretty much. The old janitor shook his head, amused. You're serious. Completely. Keanu pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before looking up. There's a flight to Norway in 3 days. Direct. We could be there by the weekend. Mr. Morales blinked. We? Keanu shrugged. I've never seen them either. Figured I'd tag along. The old man scoffed, shaking his head. Keanu Reeves is going to fly halfway across the world just to watch some lights in the sky with an old janitor? Keanu smirked. You make it sound crazy. It is crazy. Good, Keanu said. Then it's exactly what we should do. Mr. Morales stared at him, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if trying to steady himself. He had spent so long believing that life was something that happened to other people traveled, other people had adventures, other people lived. But now, sitting across from a man who had every reason to forget him but hadn't, he was starting to realize something. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before finally meeting Keanu's gaze. All right, kid, he said, let's go see the damn lights. Keanu grinned. Now you're getting it. As the city pulsed outside the window, two men sat in the glow of something neither of them could quite name a new beginning, an old promise fulfilled, a reminder that life, no matter how long you've been in the same place, can still surprise you. And this was only the start. 3 days later, Mr. Morales found himself in an airport for the first time in nearly 40 years. The last time he had been on a plane, he had been a much younger man, traveling for a family funeral. Back then, flying had felt like an obligation. This time, it felt like something else entirely. He shifted in his seat at the private lounge, still getting used to the idea that people in uniforms were walking around offering drinks and warm towels. The whole thing felt surreal, like he had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for him. Keanu, sitting across from him, noticed the way the old janitor's hands rested uneasily on his knees. You all right? Mr. Morales exhaled, shaking his head. This is just a lot. Keanu nodded. Yeah, it is. The old man chuckled. Didn't think I'd be here. Didn't think I'd ever leave that school, let alone get on a plane to another country. Keanu leaned back, a knowing look in his eyes. That's the thing about life. You don't have to stay where you started. Mr. Morales thought about that for a moment. He had spent over 5 decades in the same routine, waking up at the same time, walking the same hallways, cleaning the same floors. Now, all of a sudden, he was about to board a flight to Norway with Keanu Reeves. If someone had told him this a week ago, he would have laughed him out of the room. He looked over at Keanu. You ever wake up and feel like your life just flipped upside down? Keanu smirked. Every day. That made the old man chuckle again. He looked down at the boarding pass in his hand, rubbing his thumb over the embossed letters. Guess it's time to see what the world looks like from a different angle. Keanu lifted his glass in a small toast. 2 new perspectives. Mr. Morales hesitated, then picked up his own drink. 2 new perspectives. A few hours later, they were in the air, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin. Mr. Morales stared out of the window, watching the ground disappear below them. Keanu glanced over at him. So, what's the first thing you want to do when we land? The old man thought about it, then grinned. Find out if Norwegian lobster is as good as the one I had the other night. Keanu laughed. All right, it's a deal. The flight stretched into the night, and as the city lights faded beneath them, Mr. Morales felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was excitement. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just watching the world pass him by. He was stepping into it. The plane touched down in Norway just as the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The air was crisp and cold as they stepped outside, their breath forming faint clouds in the early morning light. Mr. Morales pulled his coat tighter around himself, looking around as if still trying to convince himself this was real. Keanu smiled. Welcome to the next chapter. They spent the day exploring, taking in the quiet beauty of the Norwegian countryside. Mr. Morales had never seen anything like it. The vast, untouched landscapes, the towering mountains, the frozen lakes that stretched for miles. At one point, he simply stopped walking and stood there, looking around in silence. Keanu waited, watching him. "What is it?" The old janitor shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just never thought I'd see the world like this." Keanu nodded. "Pretty amazing, huh?" Mr. Morales chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yeah, it is." As the sun set, they made their way to the best viewing spot for the Northern Lights, a quiet hilltop far from the city lights. The sky above them was a deep, endless black, speckled with stars. Then, slowly, it began. A faint glow rippled across the horizon, a soft green haze at first. Then it grew, stretching and twisting, dancing across the sky in waves of green, blue, and violet. It was unlike anything Mr. Morales had ever seen. His breath caught in his throat. "My God!" Keanu glanced over, smiling at the pure awe in the old man's face. "Worth the trip?" Mr. Morales didn't answer right away. He was too busy staring up at the sky, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench they were sitting on. Finally, he exhaled. "I've spent my whole life looking down, cleaning floors, keeping my head low." He swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the sky. "I never thought to look up." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture of understanding. "Well," he said softly, "you're looking now." Mr. Morales nodded, his eyes shining not just from the lights above, but from something deeper, something new. For the first time in over 50 years, he wasn't just a man who had worked himself into the ground, forgotten in the background. He was here. He was living. And as the northern lights swirled above them, painting the night sky in colors he never thought he'd see, he finally understood it was never too late to start over. Never too late to dream again. Never too late to look up. The cold air surrounded them, but neither of them moved. They just sat there, watching the lights dance, knowing that this moment, this night, was the beginning of something neither of them could have ever predicted. But maybe, just maybe, it was exactly how it was meant to be. The end.